Okay, so we're diving into Indonesia today,
Mm.
and some pretty interesting stuff happening there.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating case study.
We're going to be looking at seawalls, subsidized cooking gas,
Mhm.
and kind of like, these whispers of potential political maneuvering.
Lots going on.
Yeah, real mix of environmental concerns, economic realities,
Mhm.
and, always interesting, those policy impacts, right?
Oh, for sure. And what's really got me thinking is how these seemingly, totally separate issues are all starting to kind of converge, you know?
Yeah,
It makes you wonder, who benefits from certain policies, who gets kind of left behind.
absolutely. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Mm.
So let's start with these seawalls, right?
Mhm.
On the surface, building them seems pretty logical.
Uh-huh.
A response to illegal fishing, especially when you consider Indonesia's losing like a staggering Rp 300 trillion each year to those foreign vessels.
Yeah, it's a massive economic hit, no doubt. And protecting their marine resources, of course, crucial for a healthy ecosystem. But
Right.
these walls are going up in areas where 2.7 million traditional Indonesian fishermen depend on those waters
Wow, 2.7
for
million.
their livelihoods.
That's a huge number of people
Yeah,
potentially affected by this. Imagine, you've been a fisherman for generations,
right.
and suddenly you're told you can't access your fishing grounds because of a wall.
Exactly what happens to those families.
Yeah.
Big question, Can Indonesia find that balance between protecting its resources and making sure those fishing communities are doing okay?
Right.
And then there's the whole ownership question too.
Yeah.
The Tangerang seawall's privately owned, the one in Bekasi's state-owned.
That's interesting.
So why is that?
Yeah, is there like a totally different set of motivations at play depending on who's building the wall?
Could be.
Okay, so we've got this controversy, brewing over these seawalls, and then bam, suddenly
Yeah.
shortage of those subsidized 3-kilogram LPG canisters, those nicknamed gas melon.
Yeah, a lot of people rely on those.
Millions of Indonesians rely on those for cooking.
Essential.
Essential, yeah.
Yeah.
And the government's response is to restrict sales to those registered in the DTKS.
Right, their social welfare database.
Yeah. So the goal is to, make sure the subsidies are actually reaching the poorest households.
In theory.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But, it assumes that everyone in need is actually on that list,
Right.
which we know isn't always the case.
Nope.
And what about those who, might not have smartphones or reliable internet access
Yeah.
to even navigate this new system?
Huge barrier for some people.
Exactly.
It's a classic case of good intentions, maybe,
Yeah.
but potentially having some really unintended consequences.
Yeah.
You limit the supply when demand is high, almost guarantees you're going to see those price hikes on the black market.
Right.
So this policy could actually end up hurting the very people it's trying to help.
Okay. Now things are getting really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
We have this political analyst, Anthony Budioan,
Uh-huh.
and he's suggesting that this gas policy might actually be like a deliberate smokescreen to divert attention away from that seawall controversy.
That's a bold claim.
It is.
But it's worth exploring, don't you think?
Yeah.
Could this be a way to shift public focus away from, potentially some shady stuff happening with those seawalls?
Yeah.
What better distraction than, creating another problem that needs immediate attention?
That's kind of a chilling thought.
It is.
Using one issue to hide another, it's like a political shell game.
Yeah.
But is there any evidence to actually support this claim, or are we just, venturing into conspiracy theory land?
Well, Prabowo Subianto has apparently started to reevaluate that gas policy.
Okay.
After a lot of public outcry, people are frustrated.
They're making your voices heard.
Yeah. That tells us something.
It's actually encouraging to see that kind of pushback.
It is.
It shows that public pressure can work.
Yeah.
But let's back up for a second. For those who, aren't super familiar with the Indonesian context,
Okay.
what exactly is gas melon?
Good point.
And why is it so essential?
So gas melon refers to these bright green 3-kilogram canisters of liquefied petroleum gas,
Okay.
or LPG. And they're the primary source of fuel for cooking
Got it.
in millions of Indonesian households, especially in rural areas and among lower-income families.
So when there's a shortage,
Yeah.
it's not just an inconvenience
No, it's a major disruption to daily life
for a lot of people.
for a huge portion of the population.
Yeah, and it makes the government's response even more, significant,
Right.
restricting access to this essential resource.
Exactly.
Okay, so now I'm really starting to see the full picture here.
Yeah.
We've got these seawalls that could be cutting off fishermen from their livelihoods, a gas shortage that's hitting the poorest the hardest,
Right.
and the possibility that it's all connected to some political maneuvering.
Yeah.
It's a lot to unpack.
It's a complex web, for
Okay.
sure. But even if we just set aside that political angle for a second,
Yeah.
both of these situations are really highlighting a deeper problem.
What's that?
Policies that look great on paper, but they don't really consider what the consequences are going to be for ordinary people in the real world.
It's like they're missing that human element, the impact on those who are already the most vulnerable.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is a sobering thought. So let's kind of delve a bit deeper into the arguments for and against these policies.
Sure.
Starting with the seawalls, what are the justifications, for actually building them, aside from curbing the illegal fishing?
Well, one of the key arguments you hear is about environmental protection.
Okay.
Indonesia faces some serious challenges with coastal erosion,
Right.
damage to those marine ecosystems. So proponents are saying that these seawalls, they can act as a barrier against those strong waves, those currents.
Mitigate.
Yeah, mitigate those harmful effects, protect those coastal communities from flooding storm surges.
So it's not just about, stopping the foreign vessels. It's also about protecting the coastline and the people who live there.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the real question is, are seawalls the most effective way to achieve these goals?
Right.
We have to remember these structures, they can disrupt the natural sediment flow.
Yeah.
They can alter marine habitats and potentially harm the very ecosystems they're supposed to protect.
It's a trade-off.
There's always a trade-off.
And we can't forget about that impact on the traditional fishermen, who depend on those waters
The ones we were talking about, yeah.
for their livelihood.
Exactly. And that's what makes the different ownership models so interesting.
Yeah.
One state-owned, different motivations, maybe?
Yeah.
Are there some economic interests driving that construction of the privately owned wall, like some people are saying?
Right. It makes you wonder, is this disconnect happening because these policies are made in a vacuum
Possibly.
without really, understanding the lives of the people they affect?
Could be.
Okay, let's shift gears back to the LPG policy for a second.
Okay.
What are the arguments in favor of, restricting that subsidized gas to those registered to the DTKS?
Well, the government's main argument is about efficiency
Mm-hmm.
and targeted distribution of those subsidies. They're claiming that a big portion of the subsidized gas was being diverted to ineligible recipients, including, wealthier households, businesses. The idea is to make sure the benefits are going to those who need them most.
Makes sense.
The poorest segments of society.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable on the surface, but as we've been discussing, the implementation raises some serious concerns.
Yeah, for sure.
Not everyone living in poverty is in that database.
Right.
And relying on technology for distribution when not everyone has access creates a whole other set of problems.
Definitely. The potential for price gouging on the black market, that's a real worry.
Yeah.
This policy could backfire and end up hurting the very people that it's aimed at helping.
Yeah.
It really highlights the need for a more nuanced approach, one that considers the complexities of real-world situations.
It seems like both the seawall and the LPG issues are really exposing this disconnect
Yeah,
between policy goals and the lived reality
for sure.
of a lot of Indonesians. And that disconnect, I think, is fueling a growing sense of frustration and skepticism among the public.
Absolutely. People are starting to ask, are these policies actually designed with our best interests in mind?
Right.
Or are there other agendas at play?
Yeah.
And that brings us back to that idea of a potential diversion tactic.
Okay.
Is it possible that this whole LPG controversy is being used to kind of shift attention away from the seawall issue, which might be seen as more politically sensitive?
It's a theory worth considering.
It is.
But even if we set aside the political angle for a moment,
Okay.
what's clear is that both situations are really highlighting a much larger problem.
What's that?
This lack of consideration for the real-world impact of policies.
On ordinary people.
On ordinary people.
I couldn't agree more. There's this tendency to get so caught up in the big picture,
Yeah.
the grand narratives of environmental protection or economic efficiency. But we don't really stop to think about how these policies are actually playing out on the ground,
Right.
in the daily lives of individuals and families.
And in both of these cases, it's the most vulnerable who are bearing the brunt of these decisions.
Yeah.
The fishermen who rely on those waters to feed their families. The low-income households that are struggling to afford cooking fuel.
It's tough.
They're the ones paying the price. So what does this all mean?
Good question.
What can be done to ensure that policies in Indonesia, and really anywhere, truly benefit the people they're supposed to serve?
Well, I think it starts with a shift in perspective.
Okay.
We need to move away from this top-down approach to policymaking and start prioritizing the voices and the experiences of those who are most affected instead of just dictating solutions. We should be engaging in genuine dialogue, listening to those concerns, understanding how these policies will impact their lives.
So more community engagement, more grassroots involvement.
Absolutely. Consult with the fishermen, listen to their concerns, understand how these policies will impact their lives. Same goes for the communities that are dealing with that LPG shortage. Involve them in the decision-making process. Find solutions that actually address their needs and their realities.
It sounds like a call for more empathy in policymaking.
Exactly. And along with empathy, we need a healthy dose of critical thinking. We need to question assumptions, scrutinize that data, and really consider the potential unintended consequences of our actions.
Don't just accept things at face value.
Dig deeper, ask questions, challenge that status quo. And remember, policymaking, it's not a one-size-fits-all endeavor. What works in one context may not work in another. So we need to be flexible, adaptable, willing to adjust course when things aren't working the way they were intended.
Okay, I'm getting fired up here. This is about holding those in power accountable and demanding better for ourselves and our communities.
That's the spirit. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It takes persistence, collaboration, and a collective commitment to creating a more just and equitable society.
So let's circle back to these specific cases in Indonesia. What are some concrete steps that can be taken to address the concerns that we've been talking about?
Well, with the seawalls, conducting those thorough environmental impact assessments before any construction starts is absolutely crucial. And these assessments shouldn't just focus on the potential benefits, they also need to look at the potential risks. Particularly to those local fishing communities.
Absolutely.
We need a more holistic approach, one that weighs the costs and benefits for everyone involved.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the LPG situation? What can be done to make sure that subsidized gas is reaching those who need it most without creating further hardship?
Well, one option is to explore alternative distribution models. Instead of relying solely on the DTKS, which we've talked about has its limitations, perhaps a voucher system could be implemented where eligible households receive vouchers that they can then redeem for that subsidized gas. This could be a more targeted approach, ensuring that those subsidies are actually reaching the people who truly need them.
That's a great idea. But wouldn't that be a lot more expensive to administer?
It's possible, but the cost of not addressing these issues effectively could be far greater in the long run. We need to remember that investing in those social safety nets and making sure that everyone has equitable access to those essential resources, it's not just a moral imperative, it's an economic one. When we neglect the needs of the most vulnerable, we undermine the very foundation of a strong and sustainable society.
So it's about finding that balance between efficiency and equity.
Exactly.
Recognizing that the well-being of a nation's people is inextricably linked to its economic prosperity.
Absolutely.
This conversation has really opened my eyes to the complexities of policymaking. And the importance of holding our leaders accountable for the decisions that they make.
For sure. And I think it's also highlighted the power of informed and engaged citizens. When we raise our voices, when we demand better, and when we hold those in power to a higher standard, we can create real positive change.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the world that we want to live in.
Absolutely.
It really does. When you kind of connect all those dots, it paints a very different picture, doesn't it?
It does.
What stood out to you the most in this whole deep dive?
That's a good question.
For me, it's like how easy it is for us to just accept that surface explanation, without really thinking about those ripple effects. Especially on the people who have the least power.
What struck me is how these cases in Indonesia, they kind of reveal this universal truth about policymaking. Good intentions. They're just not enough. You have to have a way to get feedback to course correct. And most importantly, to really understand the lives of the people that these policies are actually impacting.
Exactly. It's not just about asking who benefits, right? It's also about asking who's bearing the cost.
Absolutely.
And often those are two very different groups of people.
Very different. And it's not about, demonizing policymakers either.
Right.
I think most of them genuinely want to make things better.
Yeah.
But there's a real danger in that detachment, relying on all this abstract data without actually seeing the human faces behind those numbers.
So true.
Yeah.
So back to Indonesia. We've seen how these policies are causing real anxieties.
Yeah.
Real hardship. What do you think needs to happen to ensure that future policies actually benefit the people, especially the most vulnerable?
Well, we've touched on a few solutions already, right?
Yeah.
More inclusive policy design, robust impact assessments that really consider, all the possible consequences.
Right.
Alternative distribution models that are more adaptable to people's actual needs.
Yeah, those are all great starting points. But it feels like we need something more.
Yeah.
Like something that shifts the entire mindset.
I agree with you. I think it requires a real cultural shift. A move away from that top-down decision-making and towards genuine collaboration with communities.
Yeah.
Imagine if instead of just imposing policies, governments actually sought out the input, of those who are most affected.
Like, what would that look like?
Fishermen helping to actually design sustainable fishing practices.
Wow.
Low-income families advising on the most effective ways to distribute aid.
So empowering people to have a say in the policies that directly impact their lives.
Exactly, and fostering a culture of transparency and accountability where those in power are actually held responsible for the consequences of their decisions, both intended and unintended.
It's about recognizing that, lived experience is a form of expertise.
It absolutely is.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
We started with seawalls and gas shortages.
Yeah.
And ended up exploring the very core of how society should function.
It's all connected.
Sure.
And for our listeners out there, the journey doesn't end here.
Right.
These are just two examples from one country. So what similar dynamics are playing out in your own communities?
Yeah.
What policies are being debated and who's at the table making those decisions?
Are the voices of those most affected actually being heard?
Those are the questions worth thinking about.
Because ultimately, we're all stakeholders in shaping a future.
Yeah.
Where progress actually means progress for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.